Buying your very first motorcycle, it's an exciting time. You get to look at all kinds of different motorcycles. You're looking at probably a sport bike, maybe a dual sport or an ADV, or maybe you're doing it wrong and you're looking at a scooter. Who knows? We won't judge. Unless maybe you end up on a scooter, in which case we'll judge you a little bit, but it's coming from a place of love. You might be looking at something like a Japanese motorcycle because you see people like us, you see it in the comment section all the time, recommending that you start out on usually a big 4 motorcycle. There's a lot of reasons why people might say you should start out on a big 4 bike. Reliability, cost, just ease of maintenance, all of that stuff that usually big 4 motorcycles are really good at and perhaps the European bikes aren't. Or maybe you come from a Harley house and starting on a Japanese motorcycle will get you disowned faster than being a vegan in line at Luby's. Who knows? But if you are thinking about starting out on a European motorcycle or an American motorcycle as an alternative to the standard big 4 bikes, I do have a list of 7 things that you should probably consider before you pull the trigger. Diving right in today, the first thing that you're going to want to consider when you're going with a European or Japanese motorcycle, regardless, is whether or not you want to buy new or used. This ZX6R here was purchased used, and this one was purchased brand spanking new, 0 miles on the clock. And you might be wanting that showroom shiny motorcycle. And that is a good thing to get. You know for a fact that it's going to have a warranty. It's going to have all the things set up perfectly from the manufacturer or the dealer, and who knows what you get with a used motorcycle. Usually when you're buying them from a dealership, they're plenty fine. They've been looked over, they've made sure that it's running and in good shape, but you never know if you're going from a previous owner what that condition of that motorcycle is inside and out. Now, a lot of people get really concerned about mileage numbers on motorcycles, and usually on a Japanese bike, that doesn't really matter. You can run these motorcycles forever, and they'll just keep on ticking. But you might turn and look at a European motorcycle and be like, you got 25,000 miles on the clock. It's getting to be about time to put you down for, that good long nap. And with some older motorcycles, 25 might be all you get out of one of these engines. That being said, more modern motorcycles do last a long time, so it isn't necessarily a death sentence to see a high mileage European motorcycle. Now, while mileage isn't necessarily the end-all be-all either European or Japanese, it is worth pointing out that with mileage comes service, and we're going to talk more about this in a second, but you want to make sure that if you are buying a used motorcycle that has some miles on the clock, that it has been taken care of. Make sure that you know when the last major service was done. I'm talking valves or belts or any of that stuff where you need to open up the engine. Those are super important and you cannot skip them, especially on European motorcycles and even more especially on Ducatis. Again, more on that later. Now, assuming that that wasn't done and you don't want to take it to a dealership, it is important to make sure that you know how you're going to do it or have a buddy around who can help you out. A lot of times going to a dealership is going to cost you a lot more money, and you can usually do most of this stuff. Again, Desmos on Ducatis, more on that later. But with most European motorcycles, you can service them at home. They're just a little bit more work. Now, buying non-Japanese motorcycles used from an owner who's loved and taken care of their bike, that's not all bad, especially when you look at one that has been lightly modified. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but mods are expensive, so buying one used with the mods already on it, that can save you a lot of cash. One more thing that I would like to throw out there is if you look at used motorcycles from European manufacturers, that can open you up to better beginner bikes because some of the older motorcycles are more serviceable as a beginner platform than some of their newer offerings. So that is something to consider if you're looking into the used marketplace. You might actually be able to find yourself a true beginner bike. But with that being said, I think that's a good transition into talking about power. Now, while we're talking about power, that's one thing I want to spend a little bit more time on and actually walk through. Unfortunately, a lot of non-Japanese beginner bikes find themselves outside the limits of what we might consider a beginner bike. Take, for example, Ducati and the Monster 696 I was just talking about. The 696 is putting down 79 horsepower and 51 foot-pounds of torque. While that is more beginner appropriate than the Monsters of today, which are putting down close to 111 horsepower and 69 foot-pounds of torque, that much power is still pushing the limits of a true beginner bike. When you're getting on a motorcycle, even the humble Ninja 400 is going to feel fast despite only making 43 horsepower and 25 foot-pounds at the wheel. Why? Because these bikes are so much lighter than cars. You're going to be able to get yourself up to go-to-jail speeds even on a little beginner bike. Looking at bikes from Triumph, there's only a few that I would comfortably consider a beginner bike, and that's anything with the 900cc Bonnie motor in it. It's still putting down 64 horsepower and 59 foot-pounds of torque, but it's a lot less stressed out of an engine and it's more like a cruiser. However, it's still a lot of power in the jerky hands of a beginner. Looking at their other beginner bike offering, it's the Trident putting down close to 80 ponies, which is way more than a beginner needs and probably wants. Ducati has the Scrambler 62 with a 399cc V-twin putting down 41 horsepower and 25 foot-pounds of torque, and other than that, good luck finding a beginner bike on a Ducati lot. If you look into the States, you've got the Sportster 883, which is a solid option, but those air-cooled Sporties are on their way out. The Scout 60 is not a beginner bike at all, much to my own chagrin, seeing as how I almost ended up on one. Your best option is looking at bikes from KTM, Husky, and BMW, where they have Indian-made single-cylinder motorcycles. They're cheap, reliable alternatives to the Japanese crop of beginner bikes, but are they really European? So now that we've talked a little bit about power on these motorcycles and I've shown you that there really aren't a ton of beginner bike options, it is worth talking about price. Because maybe you're looking at something that's a little bit fancier. We also do have a beginner bike option in here. Starting with the fancy options from these two motorcycles, we're gonna take a look at the MT-09 SP versus the Trident Street Triple RS. Again, neither of those are beginner motorcycles, but I wanna prove a point here. So the MT-09 SP is gonna come in at $11,099 versus the Street Triple RS, which comes in at $12,850. Whether or not you think that the extra benefit of having a metal gas tank and a perfectly velvety smooth throttle and all of the bells and whistles is worth that extra cash, that's up to you. But personally, I think it is worth a little bit of an upcharge, because even though the MT-09 SP feels like a good motorcycle in the hands, you can feel where it is just a little bit cheap and a little bit mass-produced. But we are talking about beginner bikes today, so let's take a look at two different beginner bikes next to each other and see how they stack up. The MT-07 versus the Triumph Trident. We've made a whole video comparing these two motorcycles, and while the MT-07 is my pick because it's more fun, let's talk some numbers. Now, the Trident is going to cost you $8,195 to the MT-07's $7,899. Now, looking at both of these motorcycles, you can see where 400-ish extra dollars went in the Trident. It's got stuff like rider modes, it's got a better feel, it's just more buttoned up than the Yamaha. And again, the Yamaha feels a little bit more mass-produced. The suspension is kind of woeful, but it's still just a very fun and effervescent motorcycle. So in that sense, I can see the Trident asking a little bit more for a buy-in than the Yamaha. So when it comes to the purchase price, yes, European manufacturers are more expensive to buy into, but again, I do think it's worth it for that little bit of buff in the quality of the motorcycles, because they feel a little bit more bespoke, they feel unique, and they don't feel mass-produced like your Japanese counterparts. Now this is where I get to take the gloves off and rip into Eurobikes a bit. Let's be real, you knew this was coming, and I have to talk about the cost of maintenance on Eurobikes versus Japanese motorcycles. If you want to see a full breakdown of the cost of ownership when it comes to something like a Ducati 1098 and a Gixxer 1000, I've actually already made a massive and exhaustive look at the differences between them in real world costs. I highly recommend you check that one out. I put a lot of legwork into that video, but since you're already here, let me give you the rundown. Yes, 100% European motorcycles are more expensive to own and maintain than their Japanese counterparts. I will admit to having cherry-picked data a bit, going with perhaps one of the most expensive platforms versus the cheapest, but when you look at the costs of maintaining KTM singles versus a Yamaha single, an Aprilia V4 versus a Honda V4, or a Cowie inline 4 versus a Beamer, Japanese bikes are always going to come in cheaper. There's a few factors that help drive down the price. First, you have the ubiquity of the bikes. You can't swing a stick in Austin without smacking an MT-07 rider, and when a bike is everywhere and such a known platform, basically anybody can work on it. Compare that to some specialized high-strung thumper like the KTM 500 EXCF, and you can't just take the thing over to Jimbo for a valve check. Not only that, but because Japanese bikes are everywhere, that means spare parts are also everywhere. If you have some dickhead try to steal your motorcycle, you won't have to wait 6 months for some master artisan in the rolling hills of Austria to custom fabricate you a new frame and ignition for your bike. You'll just order it, and a few days later it'll show up. Ask me how I know. Finally, for your basic service, there are a few things that will require specialized tools and knowledge on Japanese motorcycles. If you have the time and patience, you could probably tackle a valve job with a YouTube video and a service manual. But God help you if you try to do a valve job on a Ducati. There's almost no situation where you'd rather be wrenching on a Eurobike versus one from the Big Four. I do want to take a second and mention American bikes here. They are designed in large part to be maintenance-free, with Harley's self-adjusting valves and Indians being fairly easy to service. Most times you go to service your bike, it's as easy as changing the oil. I guess rolling on the same motors from 1942 helps out a little bit. Now, the last major con I wanted to talk about owning a European motorcycle as your beginner over something like a Japanese motorcycle like this one here is modifying your bike. Now, going off a point that we mentioned in the last segment, there's just a lot more Japanese motorcycles out there from the Big Four. And whether or not it's Yamaha reusing the same house calipers, Honda doing small, minor incremental changes, or Suzuki's bold new graphics, the Big Four is not exactly known for reinventing the wheel. And that means that a lot of parts from a lot of different motorcycles are interchangeable. This is something that I'm noticing a lot on my current new motorcycle. I can basically use stuff from the past generation and just slap it on there, and even some first gen stuff still fits on my current 2022 model year motorcycle, which is pretty crazy. You don't usually see that a lot with European motorcycles. Also, let's face it, if you're gonna buy a brand new fancy Euro motorcycle, the last thing that you're gonna do is run out and get yourself an M4 pipe to put on your Super Duke or your S1000RR, or maybe even your KTM 390 Adventure. You're gonna want something a little bit fancier, like a Leo Vinci pipe, an Acura, or maybe even an SC Project. It's kind of sacrilege to go and put just $20 Amazon parts on a European motorcycle, but on a DRZ 400 or something like that, it's just Tuesday. You can use whatever you want on budget Japanese motorcycles, and no one's gonna give you grief. So if you're out there looking to start on a European motorcycle as your first, you might want to hold off on sending Junior to college for a few years while you sort your motorcycle out. That or sell a kidney, whatever works. The ironic thing though is when you look at American motorcycles, the price of mods actually tanks even lower than Japanese motorcycles. So if you're looking at a cruiser, you might be able to get yourself a lot of chrome and skulls for not a lot of money. You just have to live the life covered in chrome and skulls. Oh, and fire too. Don't forget, you gotta have flames on your cruiser, otherwise is it even fast, bro? I mean, come on.
Oh, Spike, we're supposed to be talking about beginner bikes. Why are you riding around on the Tuono? That's not a beginner bike, right? I can't get a Tuono with my first bike. Well, no, you can't. But we did just put an exhaust on this motorcycle, so for the rest of this list, I'm gonna be talking at you from the seat of this Tuono. And I mean, just let me hold up real quick. I just gotta play for you the song of my people. That's so good. Oh, it's so good. Now, if you are a beginner hopping on an appropriate beginner motorcycle from Europe, you might be hearing from some folks online that European motorcycles are so much more unreliable than Japanese bikes are nowadays. And yeah, back in the day, sure, maybe that's the case, but generally nowadays, a European motorcycle is just as reliable as its Japanese counterpart in the same space. So for example, a mega hopped up motorcycle from the EU, you know, maybe an Aprilia Tuono V4 1100 factory. Maybe that is a little bit more hopped up than a Ninja 400, and you might be able to squeeze a few more miles out of a Ninja 400. However, if you're looking at something like the Trident and the MT-07, as we did earlier, the Trident and the MT-07 are going to be right on par in terms of reliability. They're both just going to run. They're both going to work, start up for you every time. Now, I know a lot of people, and the reason why I'm on the Aprilia today, want to talk about how, oh, you know, they're sure they're made a couple of strides, but they're still going to explode. I mean, you remember how the RS660 engines exploded? And I'm like, yes, they did have a couple of bad runs on those bikes, but they did recall all units that were affected and gave you a brand new motor. And that's not down necessarily to anything that Aprilia did. It's just, you know, bad metallurgy. And that happens in Japanese motorcycles, happens in American motorcycles, happens in European motorcycles. So that is an outlying circumstance. So if somebody's telling you, oh, the RS660 exploded, your RS660 is going to blow up. No, it's probably not. You're probably just fine riding around on a European bike. Now, the last thing, the last reason why you might want to start on a European motorcycle as opposed to a Japanese bike is European bikes are cooler. I mean, let's be honest. It's so much cooler to walk into some place and say, yeah, I ride a motorcycle. Oh, what bike are you on? I'm on a Ducati Scrambler. You know, you start on that little 400, the 62. Or I'm on a Triumph. I mean, how cool does that sound versus, yeah, I'm on a Yamaha, or I'm on a Kawasaki, or I'm on a Honda. You say Honda to somebody and they're going to think Civic, not Fireblade. So there is a genuine cool factor to riding around on a European motorcycle that you just don't get with Japanese bikes. And there are some legitimately cool Japanese motorcycles out there. The leader bikes from Japan. I mean, they're sweet. They're awesome. MT10, we talked about it a little bit earlier. Well, the MT bikes generally, they're ugly, but they're so cool. But generally, they're, you know, they're a little bit more milquetoast. They're more common. You see them everywhere. And sometimes you want to be on that rarer motorcycle. It's cooler. And I would totally understand somebody who wants to get on their first motorcycle and stand out from the crowd. And that's a great thing that European motorcycles do. You just have to weigh it against everything else that we talked about earlier today. And with that, I'm going to wrap this video up because it is getting nice and long and doesn't need to be any longer than it already is. Remember, if you would like to win the ZX6 that you saw earlier, the RSV4 that RSV4, this is a Tuono that I'm riding right now. Click those links down in the description below. Get yourself over to shop.yammynoob.co. Get yourself, you know, anything for your beginner bike, your intermediate bike, your expert bike. No matter what you're on, we've got something for you. Tires, bags, riding gear for you to keep yourself safe while you're rolling. If you want any of that stuff, click the links down in the description below. Get yourself signed up to win any of these motorcycles, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. See you later.